All right, guys, welcome back. We are continuing our discussion and talk about the Civil War and specifically about kind of what's going on behind the scenes, behind the actual fighting. I'm going to start you all off with a picture here of the destruction of Richmond and the kind of the ruins of Richmond. Remember that as the Union is driving south in the final days of the war, Richmond is besieged and is actually going to be burned to the ground by the Confederates as they retreat kind of south and west from this area. So here's a little picture of that. And it obviously shows the South's going to have a lot of work to do after the war. Anyway, let's get into how the war is changing. The unique thing about this war is that it's involving civilians, American civilians, in ways that we don't see before this. Even the Revolutionary War. Remember, most of the citizens in America in the Revolutionary War are what we label as fence sitters. And so they don't really necessarily have a vested interest one way or the other. They kind of watch and wait to see it play out. Not so in the Civil War. Everybody has a position, right? Like, because you can't help but be in a state that's either in the Union or in the South. So we're going to label this a total war, okay? Not a world war, but a total war. And if you've heard that term before, a total war just simply refers to the fact that all resources are going to be marshaled to fight, and that civilians' lives, and the demarcation between what is a civilian life and what is a military life is blurred, right? We can't really tell what that is. So, the Civil War is going to be very, very impactful for both sides. It's also going to revolutionize the economies of both regions, with industrialization winning out. Abraham Lincoln's opposed by a group known as the Copperheads. They are also peace Democrats that are looking to end the war as soon as possible. Abraham Lincoln is going to continue the war as long as possible to make sure that the South gets back into the United States. Jefferson Davis, of course, he's running a country that, at its very essence, doesn't want to have a very strong executive, right? And so he has to figure out, especially if the South wins, what his role looks like. Foreign relations, okay, this is a major challenge on both sides. The South really wants British support. They need to break the Union blockade. Of course, the British don't really support slavery anymore, so it's one of those things that if the British actually end up supporting the South, is going to be out of a sense of the fact they need the South for trade, and that they also think the South's going to win no matter what. Inflation runs rampant, but the rate of the South is 80 times out of the North, which is really, truly staggering. A truly staggering number. Labor shortages on both sides, which are going to allow women to start working, and we're also going to see class conflict between rich and poor increase. Okay, women taking up 2 million jobs that men are leaving behind. 2 million jobs, right? 3 million people end up fighting in this whole ordeal. But they'll work in fields, they'll work in factories, they'll become nurses. So women really truly, maybe for the first time in American history, we see them gain employment, gain money, and gain independence as a result, and a stake in this American experiment. Overall, we can say that the war is a struggle between two societies, not two armies, right? And we don't need to beat a dead horse, but you can see that. You can see that the southern way of life and the northern way of life is just very, very different. And that major difference is built because of slavery, right? Even though, not necessarily, even the majority of Southerners don't even own any slaves. The war will also make Abraham Lincoln what we would say, or at least what your textbook says, is the most important American president. And that's, of course, debatable, right? I think it's interesting when we hear that, if it's true or not. I think the evidence certainly points that he's expanding the role of the monarch. That's funny. He's kind of acting like a monarch. The role of the executive quite intensely. All right, once again, guys, we're going to kind of go through these guided notes, and I filled them out. Make sure to pause anytime you want to kind of figure out what's going on here, okay? And you can, like I said, you can pause and write stuff down. All right, the Emancipation Proclamation, okay? This is a major, major event during the Civil War. It's announced after Antietam in 1862 that all slaves, okay, in Confederate states were to be free if they were still in rebellion January 1st, 1863. So it's kind of like a warning. In September, Lincoln basically says, listen, we are going to free slaves if you're still in rebellion. If you come back into the United States, then we'll let you keep your slaves, right? It's kind of maybe like a one last ditch effort to say, hey, slavery is not the issue. Do not secede. Come back. If you don't, then we'll continue fighting the war and your slaves can feel free to leave you. Now, he doesn't really have jurisdiction to do this, but he does it anyway, okay? Border states, okay, do not apply. These will still have slavery after the emancipation. So Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and West Virginia, and even actually some counties down in Louisiana will have slavery still in existence, okay? All right? The North is not fighting this war to end slavery. Why? Because they think that slavery will die on its own. And most Northerners, most Republicans aren't like these diehard abolitionists, right? Just because you're a Republican doesn't make you an abolitionist. Now, certainly Lincoln wants to get rid of slavery and halt the expansion of slavery, but he knows that his political movement is more than just freeing slaves at the first moment's notice. He gets some opposition from Northern Democrats who don't care about slavery at all and just want the war to be over. They kind of sniff out that Lincoln is using the proclamation to kind of press the Confederacy to keep fighting, because he knows, they know that it's going to piss them off, right? Like the idea of another country, at least according to the Confederacy, freeing slaves seemed a little bit backwards, and this whole idea of Southern honor and chivalry, they're not gonna like just kind of roll over at this proclamation. They're, if anything, going to get more upset, right, at the audacity of the North to declare all slaves free. George McClellan, the former general, in fact, actually, he would be the general at this time of the Union forces, the Army of Potomac. He does not favor freeing slaves, right? But he does like the idea eventually of having them as contraband, right, as kind of like a war spoils group of people that can fight or work or whatever, kind of like a horse would be, right? Like you win a horse in battle and you can apply them for work. But he does not necessarily think that the two races are equal at all, okay? Lincoln waits until Antietam to issue the proclamation, right? He needs a major battle, a major win to basically flaunt this policy. There would be incredible political backlash, maybe even calling for him to step down as president if he had lost the battle and then issued this proclamation. Okay, the proclamation will pave the way towards the eventual 13th Amendment, which is passed after the war, and this is the amendment that will formally abolish slavery. So don't think the Emancipation Proclamation is like the locked-in law forever constitutional change that allowed slavery to get over. That's not what it is. In fact, many say that the proclamation freed no slaves at all. It was just in Confederate states. It didn't free slaves in border states. And the real mission is to seize the property, right? So, don't think this is some huge altruistic ploy of Lincoln's to get rid of slavery. If anything, it just kind of bides some time, for the war to either let the Confederacy back in or seize all their property. All right, diplomacy, okay? Diplomacy, of course, refers to talking, right? Like a diplomat is someone who is engaged in talking with especially foreign powers over certain issues. And on both sides, we have a lot of talking going back and forth between the North and Europe and the South and Europe. Now, Europe is incredibly reliant on cotton in the South. Okay, 75% of the British cotton comes from the Confederacy, and it's used in textile mills in industrialized cities in Europe. All right, specifically in Britain, to kind of churn out finished goods. Okay, as a result of the war, by 1863, cotton importation is 3% of the pre-war level. Right, so this is like an enormous downturn. Right, only 3% of 75% is getting in. So this is like, a drastic kind of meltdown of raw materials coming from the United States. And both kind of need access to cotton, right? France is willing to support the South. Napoleon III is the president of France, right? He wants cheap cotton, and he wants, expanded French presence in North America, especially Mexico, right? So, both sides are going to kind of wait and watch and see what's going to happen in the Civil War. Having a weak America is actually beneficial in some ways to Europe because they get to kind of dominate the world at this point, dominate economies. But neither side is willing to jump ship unless they know for sure that it's a sure thing for the North or the South. The Union is sending wheat to Britain. Half of the British imports are coming from the Union. So even though they're getting cotton from the South, they're getting their literal food from the North. There's famines all over Europe. Okay. Also, iron, shipbuilding, or other industries that Britain and the North are kind of both engaging in. And the two men who are kind of making the case are the Secretary of State, William Seward. Actually, this guy is going to end up buying Alaska, and then the British ambassador, Charles Adams. And these are basically two of the major Northern diplomats who are making sure that the North has an exclusive relationship with Britain or maintaining neutrality. The British, of course, will not end up joining the Confederacy. Britain had gotten rid of the transatlantic slave trade. If they join the Confederate cause, they join the slave cause. They're basically saying, hey, we're abandoning our anti-slavery stance and legitimately supporting a culture that is okay with enslaving humans. Jefferson Davis will end up getting so desperate that by 1864 he is willing to free all of the slaves to get British support. Of course, by now we're past Antietam, we're past Gettysburg, and this is a desperate attempt, right? It's kind of too little, too late. Many of the slaves in the South had already run away. And so it was kind of like an empty promise or a useless promise, I guess, to get rid of slavery when the writing's on the wall that the end is coming anyway. And so might as well just let it take its course. Okay, for these next two sections, I'm kind of going to go pretty quickly. We're looking at the northern home front and the southern home front, okay? And there are some differences to what's happening in the north versus the south. But we do want to touch on a couple issues, what women are doing, and then what the draft is doing, okay? Major women in the North, we're going to talk about Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton. These are two nurses, okay? Clara Barton is going to form the American Red Cross, which is going to be a humanitarian relief organization during the war. And nurses, I'm going to actually go to question 2. Nurses is kind of a new occupation, especially in the South. And there's going to be nurses in the South. We'll talk about it in a minute. Are not supposed to see the gore of war, right? Women have been working in some industries. Remember that, maybe many of the early textile factories in America were staffed by women. But now new jobs in civil service, right? So government clerks, agricultural work, and also soldier societies and nursing will be open to women, and they can enter into the workforce. Okay, union manufacturing is growing enormously during this time. The economy in the North is booming. Coal and iron production will reach record levels. Merchant tonnage, so how many goods are shipped, increases dramatically. Traffic on railroads in the Erie Canal is up 50%. Right, so industrialists in the North are making enormous amounts of money. And it's not trickling down. Shareholders and the very rich are getting richer, and actually there's kind of bad inflation, and the wages aren't keeping up with that. Wages are going up, but we would say real wages are lagging behind, right? So industrialists, the rich are getting very, very wealthy, and then kind of all the workers are getting poor, which is going to set a stage for some labor conflict after the war. Okay, the North will also institute a draft to get soldiers into the war. Remember, initially, Lincoln wants a million men in his army, right? 1862, Lincoln calls for an extra 300,000 volunteers. Each state had a quota, right? If it's not met, then there'll be a draft. Sure enough, there is a draft in 1863, and it's not met very well. There are riots. People don't necessarily want to join the war, but Lincoln needs soldiers, right? Remember, at this point later in the war, when Ulysses S. Grant is the general in charge, he's called the Butcher for a reason. He's sacrificing enormous amounts of men to wear down the South and wear down the South and wear down the South. Okay, those who are rich, they could buy their way out of service by hiring a substitute. Okay, which is seen as unfair, which it is, right? Like everyone should serve their country, whether they're rich or poor. But that's not. There's literally loopholes in the North that made it possible for you to buy your way out. In the North, we see a lot of violence, anti-black violence. Actually, you see a picture here of a Northern mom hanging a black person, right? It kind of decrying or showing that slavery or black people caused the war, which of course wasn't true. But there's mass riots, mass reactions in the North, to this draft and to the war as it gets longer and longer and longer, which is to the benefit of the South, right? Their whole idea was to basically keep fighting until the North just said to stop fighting. In the South, we also see riots. We have food riots, though. Inflation is way worse. There's shortages of shoes, clothing, blankets, money, and food. Salt, wheat, cornmeal, meats of all kinds. Those are all hard to find. And we have these people that are known as profiteers, and they're really scandalous and horrible people. They buy up, basically extra goods or a massive supply of goods in order for the hope of selling it for a higher price later down the road, right? So they're making money off of suffering of normal everyday people. And, in large part because of their actions, we see food riots in Mobile, Atlanta, and Richmond. And, because we see these 80% inflation rates, and it's just absolutely insane to pay, that much for food when you're just trying to live, right? So violence will spill out as well. And we're going to label this sort of phenomenon, and the Civil War will truly become labeled as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Wealthy Southerners could also hire a substitute, and you were also exempted if you own more than 20 slaves, right? So that's not very good for morale. And honestly, at one point, 1/3 of the Confederate Army abandoned to go home, right? Like there was no reason to fight, especially it dragged on and on and on. And so the South couldn't really, resupply troops the way that the North could. And that ultimately led to their downfall. That and some big losses as Lee was invading the North. Women are also entering the workplace. They're clerks in the Confederate government, school teachers, and also nurses. Two of these big nurses are Sally Louisa Tompkins and Kate Cumming, right? They're not supposed to see the sights of war, but they do anyway. So, there is progress here for Southern women, but overall it's a pretty bad time. Like it's war in the South is a very devastating consequence. In a lot of ways, similar to World War I would be in Europe. If you ever read a book named by the name of Cold Mountain, you'll see exactly how this went down. It just devastates some Southern communities. Now, the next thing we'll talk about is the election of 1864. Okay, by this point, the Union has gained the upper hand. Just before the election, we find out that Sherman has seized Atlanta, and more or less we know that he'll cut the country in half. But still, it's not a foregone conclusion that Lincoln will win the war. Okay, the war was going poorly. All right, there's some major wins, but the North had lost 65,000 soldiers in 1864 alone. So that's a huge dent, huge dent in the Army. I think they had lost just barely over that in the previous 3 years. Jubal Early, a Confederate general, came within 5 miles of the White House. So it's kind of just like what the South wanted. They wanted the North to feel the effects of the Southern resilient method of fighting the war, right? If the northern citizens believe that the war will never be over, then they're not going to vote for Lincoln. And Lincoln is really the only one that wants to continue fighting the war. Lincoln also suspends habeas corpus. This is, of course, the law it's the kind of constitutional right that enables you to be charged with the crimes. So you're not just thrown into prison willy-nilly without, a hope of a trial. But he suspends it, and it's ruled unconstitutional by Roger B. Taney, who, of course, is, remember, one of these he's a border state guy, but he's a slave owner that generally rules not in favor of Republican policies. So a lot of people want to see Lincoln out. They think he's abusing his power. They think he's a tyrant. But like I said, the whole story changes when Sherman takes Atlanta and divides the Confederacy in half even more. Okay, McClellan will do pretty well. He'll actually only win 2 states, but he polls in at 45% of the vote. The popular vote is going to be won by about 400,000. So Lincoln truly will get a majority. Remember, in 1860, Lincoln only gets 40% of the popular vote. So this kind of change in the tide of the war shows that the North will eventually win. The Confederacy cause is doomed, and even Louisiana. Look at that. Louisiana is got parishes that are back in the Union and are voting for this presidential election. Last thing we'll talk about today is the assassination of Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. We won't get into this in detail. It's a fascinating story how this happens. John Wilkes Booth is an actor from Maryland, and he is a strong believer in slavery and white supremacy, and he thinks that Lincoln's plans are going to ruin America. Okay, and he has a couple of plans that are foiled earlier than April 1865, which is when Lincoln's killed, to kidnap Lincoln actually, and they end up failing. But as soon as the war is over, and this April 11th, Lincoln starts making plans on what a new America looks like, and Booth gets the idea that he needs to step in and get Lincoln out of the way, right? So he has this elaborate kind of plan to not just kill Lincoln, right, but also to kill the Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State Seward all on the same night, right? Lincoln goes to a play at the Ford Theater, a play known as Our American Cousin. Ulysses S. Grant is supposed to be there, but he goes to New Jersey instead to visit his kid. And during the play, John Wilkes Booth walks up behind Abraham Lincoln, shoots him once in the back of the head, jumps down to the stage and yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," or I think it's actually pronounced "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning "Thus be it ever to tyrants." Right. In the meantime, he gets hung up on a flag and breaks his leg and has to hobble out of the theater, which is actually sort of comical if you think about it, like sadistically comical that he just killed a president, maybe our most important president, and then gets his foot caught in a flag and breaks it. Secretary of State Seward is stabbed and wounded but not killed. Okay, so the conspiracy is sort of effective. And Booth ends up running into Virginia, into a tobacco barn, and he's caught up by federal soldiers, and he ends up being shot by a guy by the name of Boston Corbett. Okay, as he's kind of being flushed out from this burning fire, right? The last words we hear out of Booth's mouth are "useless, useless," right? Which it is kind of useless, like why would you shoot Abraham Lincoln, right? What's strange is how easily Lincoln, or maybe not easily, how effectively Lincoln's plan for the restructuring of the Union is carried out after he's actually shot. We'll get into more of that next chapter. Good luck with your questions. Let me know if you need anything. Thanks.